How does it make me feel? Locked up.
To achieve. Sad, I think.
I'm in a Star Wars movie.
It makes me feel like weird, but it's interesting.
It looks like it's trying to protect itself.
Boston in the 1950s was desperate. There was a lot of population drain. It had the highest property taxes in the continental US. The tallest building in the 1950s was the Custom House Tower down near Faneuil Hall.
So architecturally, Boston had been conservative and wanted to show the world that it was architecturally moving into the future as well. Boston wanted a symbol that would show that drive towards the future. The process for choosing a city hall was actually a competition.
The 8 finalists, 7 out of the 8 were all in concrete. The architects who proposed buildings for the City Hall competition all saw this as an opportunity to do something that was different than what they perceived as faceless corporate architecture.
I think those architects were looking to design in a modern material that to them felt like it was more authentic than steel and glass. They felt that those steel and glass buildings had kind of become veneers and were very slick. And I think they thought that concrete was a material that it had what they thought of was integrity. And they meant that at kind of both the aesthetic level, that it would be a single material that would make the building integral. That is, all parts of the building, structure, decoration, surface, everything would be a single material. And for them, that meant that it had integrity, that it was kind of virtuous and honest.
It happened to come at this moment where the reinvention and the reinvestment in cities happened to collide with this idea of a material being more inherently about a civic movement. The expressive nature of them was something that was embraced and really pushed to extremes, especially in Paul Rudolph's Health and Human Services building.
There's a whole spectrum of ways that these architects worked in concrete, and there was by no means agreement amongst them what the goals were of using it. Brutalism was never a term that was used at the time. It has to do with that French term béton brut, raw concrete, so that B-R-U-T didn't mean brutal in the way that we mean it, but it was just the French word for rough.
The folks who coined the term brutalism were British architects Peter and Alison Smithson. And the Smithsons were reacting against this very refined glass box architecture that was popular at the time. They thought that architecture should reflect the modern angst of the 1950s and 1960s. And they said, we are not living in a refined age. Our architecture should not be refined. So the imperfections of concrete and the ugliness of concrete was, for them, a philosophical statement, and it was deliberate.
It is a material, concrete, but it is a liquid first, and it requires something to be cast against before it becomes form. So that idea of a formwork that makes the form is something that each architect took on as an individual project. City Hall, if you go there, you will see the imprintation of the wood panels that were used. You can still rub your hands against the grain of the wood that was there. Rudolph, he was more interested in the kind of robust textures of bush-hammered concrete. And then in the work of Pei and Kasuda, they saw it as a noble continuation of limestone and developed a fiberglass mold that they cast against so that it became almost as smooth as stone. At the opposite end of the spectrum, you have someone like Breuer, who's interested in the plasticity of the material to create very complex, repetitious patterns. These are immensely labor-intensive, handcrafted buildings, from the conception of them as architectural objects to the actual making of them through the skilled labor that existed at the time. You can see the efforts of the humans that made them explicitly in the final built form.
They felt that people would be able to respond to those shapes and forms like they hoped that people did to abstract art, that it would simply be the kind of the perception of space and light and form and texture that would be enough for people to appreciate buildings. They overestimated people's capacity to appreciate abstraction.
The way in which people talked about City Hall was, as one of the world's ugliest buildings, that it was designed to hurt people, that it was a monstrosity. Concrete is given as an example of something that's monstrous, so concrete monstrosity. But there is something about this which is what we call escape from ugly valley, in which, if you look again, that pairing of words, concrete and monstrosity, if you rewind 50 years, it's not a concrete monstrosity, it's a Victorian monstrosity. The preservation movement is really born out of the destruction and demolition of Victorian buildings.
Behind the mask of this ugly Victorian dwelling is a charming colonial-type home. Let's watch it evolve as the bric-a-brac is stripped off.
20 or 30 years later, people all of a sudden rediscovered the value of Victorian buildings, and now those are the buildings that people are preserving. I think we're seeing the same thing with brutalism today. The support for brutalism may not be quite as widespread as it was for Victorian architecture, but I think all architectural styles go through vicissitudes of reputation. What's loved today will be hated tomorrow, only to come back as an admired vintage style sometime in the future.
The idea that what one generation finds ugly, the next generation can start a movement to preserve is something that we need to recognize. There's now new monsters on the horizon. The glass and steel monstrosity is now what people are enraged about, not necessarily concrete.